I thought we probably should get going, although many of you are still nibbling and settling in. I hope that's okay. I also thought this could easily be a much more interactive session than the keynote. Those are usually a talking head experience, but I thought this could definitely be interactive. So please, if you have thoughts or comments and want to get them up, I'll do my best if I can hear, and I think the acoustics in here are pretty good from my perspective. I'll try to repeat or restate the question for the benefit of those that are joining us digitally and from a remote location. I also don't want to have any pretense that I'm the expert on this material. In fact, actually, this was a session that I felt kind of privileged to do. Larry White called up and said, you know, it'd be good to do something at the conference on the president's agenda. And I've been around enough of this that I thought I'll do what I've been meaning to do all along, is try to assemble some materials to try to make some sense of a timeline and who said what when. In fact, I think that's really what your deliverable is in this session, is just sort of a resource guide of critical points on the path. It's probably not complete, but it certainly hits some of the major points. And I found it helpful to try to figure out what has happened. Many of you may have experienced what I did, is I watched the President's State of the Union address, and then I went to bed, and I got up in the morning, and the next morning on the White House page there was a scorecard with my school on it, basically with a credit score. And then I heard about the supplemental memo from the State of the Union address, and I don't really remember that practice in the past where you talk about the State of the Union and then supplement the State of the Union afterwards with something that's just, you know, decisively important for the future of higher education. So, you know, a lot of this material has been dropped on us in a very interesting way and hasn't entirely been flagged or organized in any sort of coherent package. I'm going to take an attempt at that, but I don't think there's any way to do this that's not controversial. And again, I hope you realize that for the most part, I'm not staking out positions on this. Like you, I'm trying to find my way through what is going on with the President's agenda related to core mission delivery. You were in the keynote this morning, I assume, and you know that from my perspective, I think there are three major themes in the air: safety, core mission accountability, governance. We're focused essentially on the second one, the core mission issues, recognizing that they are interconnected, however. So I don't want to completely disassociate that. The talk title really raises the question that I have in the back of my mind is, are we going through a necessary reformation stage, or are we taking a big step backwards? You know, what is this? Is this a retreat from 50 years of good practice, or is it a potentially positive reformative practice? And I don't know that I have an answer for that. I have a lot of thoughts about it, I'm sure you do too, but it seems to me that that's the central question: is we're heading someplace. Is it better? Is it familiar? Is it worse? I don't know. And again, I'll see if we can sketch through some of that. Let's go to our first, that is the slide, there you go. The backdrop. I think to start this discussion on affordability and quality, it helps to try to give some sense of the forces that were moving before some of the changes became visible. There's certainly some tectonic plate type activity going on that's not necessarily visible to the naked eye. It's something that is apparent more in the retrospect than it is at the time it's occurring. What are some of the things that are out there? I think one of the major change agents that's been culminating in the White House changes has been the role of Lumina Foundation and Lumina's relationship to the Bologna process and its long-standing position on degree qualification frameworks, which the first time I heard all of this stuff, only Bologna I knew about was a sandwich meat. I wasn't familiar with the Bologna process until I had a chance to talk with Holiday McKiernan, who's their executive director at Lumina. And I had not entirely understood the power and significance of Lumina Foundation and its critical role in changing policy on higher education in the United States. I assume that many of you are aware of how Lumina was founded. Lumina is a spin-off nonprofit from the USA Group situation. You might remember there was a bit of a challenge related to lending practices inside colleges. And among the issues that were on the table at the time were individuals were helping students place student loans in the old indirect lending model, but they weren't disclosing their relationship with certain banks, so that you might be dealing with a person who was pushing a product from a vendor, essentially a bank, but not necessarily disclosing that relationship to a student. The Justice Department got involved. There was an agreement, and as part of the agreement, USA Group decided to spin off and create a foundation called Lumina with a mission to promote essentially access and opportunity in higher education. And they were given an initial grant of money which was quite substantial from USA Group, and then through a corporate transaction, certain shares were sold to the company, et cetera. They were able to whipsaw their endowment, and at last I understood it was somewhere in the range of about $1 billion. They're one of the most heavily endowed groups with a higher education focus ever. Their original board consisted of a lot of original members from the USA Group, but a lot of people were concerned about that, so a lot of the original board members connected with USA Group left the board and turned over leadership to a new cast of characters, largely unconnected with USA Group. So what you've got is a foundation, a private foundation that's out there with a focus on higher education, in particular opportunity and access, with a tremendous resource bank and a tremendous amount of influence. When the Obama administration came in, the Lumina Foundation became very prominently connected with consulting arrangements with Department of Education and became an assistant in many ways to DOE as it was evolving some of its ideas. And my understanding is that they played a pretty heavy role in helping the department articulate and understand gainful employment regulations for the for-profit industry, et cetera. This also times out a little bit when the Obama administration came in with the shift to direct lending, because it was quite clear that the department under Obama wanted to move away from the old indirect lending model to a more direct lending model. So all of this is happening about the same time. Lumina, a new foundation, relatively new, lots of money, a focus on higher ed access and opportunity, now gets a good consulting arrangement with the U.S. Department of Education. And, you know, the cognoscenti inside Washington were pretty aware that Lumina was exercising a great deal of influence over the agenda the Department of Education was adopting for the future. Of course, that agenda is, in many ways, the president's agenda. So that's where I think it's important to realize right out of the gate this critical role that a foundation, Lumina, played. What's the connection with these other ideas? Europe was going through a process of trying to evaluate its higher education systems and how they interacted with each other. My impression is that the European educators had realized that after World War II, particularly after the 1980s, European education lost a step globally. It was no longer as competitive with the US systems, so that families that might have sent their children to Oxford or Italy or Germany would start sending their kids to Cal Poly, MIT, Harvard, et cetera. And the US education system was becoming the gold standard for higher education, which, you know, if you know the history of higher education, is quite a shift. We borrowed most of our higher education ideas from Europe, England first and then Germany later. And so we were the copycats, but after World War II, and particularly in the late 20th century, the United States was beginning to gain global education hegemony, if you want to think of it this way, if we were in competition. The Bologna process wanted to look at that and to understand how the European Union could form a more effective education unit. And among the challenges were that you could start a degree in Ireland, but then move to Italy, and your credits were unclear. You know, did you really study enough chemistry to take a degree at an Italian university or a German institution? And so students were struggling as they moved around the continent and moved from program and program, country and country, to get some sense of commensurability. If you've traveled to Europe, you've probably blown up at least one hairdryer or electric razor. And it really was the same problem. It's a fairly small geographical area with different railroad systems, different electrical systems, different food cultures, And the same thing was happening in the education system. And what it was essentially doing is it was a brain drain. A lot of the really sharp European students would say, I'd love to stay in Europe and start at Oxford, finish in France, but I'm going to spend so much time trying to figure out if my degrees are commensurable and how many credit hours I need, that from a cost-effective and an education standpoint, I might as well just go to Princeton and do it all there. And it'll be one size fits all. I'll get really good instruction. It'll all be coherent, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the Bologna process was really aimed at this kind of commensurability, trying to understand what's a credit hour, what's being taught, what is a degree qualification, what do you really have to learn, how is that assessed, is there consistency in assessment, et cetera. And again, I think much of the Bologna energy was devoted at European Union unification, but also global competitiveness. Because the European sector of education is a major player in global higher education and was starting to run the risk of being number 2 or maybe even number 3 behind the emerging Chinese systems and other areas of the world that are building quality higher education units. Lumina became very interested in that. They've actually hired consultants who are experts in the Lumina process. I work with Tim Birtwistle, for example, who actually left his job in Europe to become a full-time consultant essentially with Lumina and assist them in making the Bologna transformation. Their leaders have actually written in educated journals about lessons learned from the Bologna process. Most of it is in what I think of as hyper-education speak. It's a lot of baffle gab. You have to kind of understand how they were thinking and talking and the words they were using. You either have access to it or it's a little bit like watching your kids play one of those video games. You're not really sure what the red button and the blue button do, but the 12-year-olds do. It has that kind of feel to it. So I would imagine in this room there's quite a range of diversity of ability to access some of this material. Some of it comes very naturally to some of you. Others, it would seem very, very unfamiliar. But again, Lumina very much based its blueprints on what it learned from the Bologna process and degree qualification analysis, which was connected with this Bologna process. In the readings, I gave you access to some of the links to critical documents that have been generated by Lumina, one of which explains DQPs in some painstaking detail. If you're more interested in this topic, it's something that I think for further reading would be very edifying, because it actually is written in an accessible way and it makes a lot more sense. Again, what's the focus? Commensurability, trying to identify what is a credit hour, what is a degree, how is learning assessed, what kind of outcomes are being assessed, what kind of competencies do students develop that are transferable. As Lumina will often put it in their writings, they wanted to do an analysis of a shift away from what's being taught to what's being learned. What is being learned, how is it being learned, and are the ways that we measure learning consistent and understandable and useful in an education system when it's conceived more broadly. And again, all the time that this is happening in Europe, the United States is not really doing anything terribly similar on any level of intensity similar to the Bologna process, although people in the United States are studying competencies and outcomes and assessments and learning, et cetera. It simply just doesn't have an equivalency here in the United States. We really just haven't had our own Bologna process. Lumina in many ways was importing Bologna to the United States. Yuck, yuck, yuck. And nothing is terribly funny right after lunch. I can tell you're already like, first you hit us with the compliance stuff, now this. Thank you so very much. Scaffolding. It is also connected to the idea, which has been in the evolving learning science, that higher learners learn on a scaffolding process and move up rungs of a ladder in some kind of a sequence. One of the concerns is, coming out of the Bologna process, that students wouldn't be prepared to move 3 or 4 rungs up a ladder because their foundational program didn't give them the platform to scaffold up the learning ladder. So that when we do commensurability and try to bring a learning focus at what is learned, it's very critical to focus on how people learn, and the leading theories seem to really gravitate to this idea of scaffolding up. From a perspective of putting a conference like this together, Chuck and I could talk to you for hours about the challenges of scaffolding in an interdisciplinary conference. You run a Title IX session, for example, at a session like this, and you've got some people who are experts. They're already close to the heavens, and they want to be able to climb up steps very, very high up the ladder. And then you have people who are dabblers or initiates, new to the job, and they're at a very different place. When you're working in a membership group, you have a better sense of tracks, so you can track people to their point on the ladder. Interdisciplinary conferences perpetually struggle with this issue of where is the target zone where people are understanding you but not being bored, that they're getting something, not being left behind. Very, very challenging, because in this room we have differential learners, different places on the ladder. It just illustrates the scaffolding concept, and I think as you go through this week, for a couple of days here in Vermont at this wonderful conference, you're going to come into some rooms and think, I really wanted more out of this session. I thought the speaker was going to go into more depth. And you'll walk out of another session and think, I was lost for a while. It was a little too fast for me. And this is a natural feeling at an event like this, that there's no way that all the programming could hit everybody at the same level at the same time. What was Lumina focused on? What was Bologna focused on? Let's try to level this as much as we can so that students will know that they're prepared for something. Translation, what happens if someone attempts a program and they don't have the scaffolding? They are not prepared for that program. They quit. They don't complete, and you have a retention problem. It's an enrollment management issue. So making sure that people are prepared for what they're doing is critical for initial and long-term success. Otherwise, your programs become remedial if they're going to retain people. And I've seen this firsthand in law schools. It's interesting when the president attacked law school length in his recent junkets, because one of the reasons law school is so long now is that there's a lot of remedial work that's being done because of things people didn't learn in college. One of the things that's really startling to me as a law professor is about half of my students have very significant challenges communicating and writing. I mean, their basic written communication skills, apart from legal articulation, are not what they were 20 years ago, that the average is much lower. So we now run at least 2 full courses, 8 credits of material designed to make sure that everybody can get to a certain point on the platform. I get a few students, frankly, many of them have been educated in England or Germany or someplace where English was a second language, and they jump right past that program because their skill set's much higher than the average. But a lot of American students have actually been cheated out of just a good basic education in written communication. And we're talking things like punctuation, spelling, dangling participles, verb, subject, agreement, things that are really, really basic communication skills. So we have had to actually change law school because the scaffold was showing us that a lot of our kids couldn't learn the law because they couldn't communicate at all in writing at a sufficient level to demonstrate that they had learned something about the law. That, again, is a challenge that we've had, just to illustrate the scaffolding point. All right, Lumina becomes a big player, a spin-off from a banking organization, essentially, with a new mission. Who else hits the pavement? Gates. And it's not just Gates, and again, there are other foundations that have been big players, but in many ways, Lumina and Gates have really established themselves as major players in the new agenda world. And of course, Gates, very focused on technology. So this is a technology-driven foundation that's pushing the use of technology in education. What do you see that's change agents in higher education? It's interesting. Banking, lending, technology. I joke with people, although it's not entirely a joke. I worked on Wall Street in the 1980s, and I see some incredible parallels with what happened in the 1980s to American business and what's happening to American higher education as a business in the 20-teens. It's remarkable to me to see this all over again, because what drove change in the 1980s on Wall Street? A change in banking and lending practices and technology. Computerized trading, changes in the definition of the money supply, monetary changes that were based on digital changes, the bank card came into being, which I think was an enormous shift in the economy at that time. And then, of course, I worked at a firm that represented Drexel Burnham, the traders that I'm sure you're so familiar with if you read Enemy at the Gates. And we became familiar with something that I had not been familiar with prior to law school, investment banking. And the growth of the world of so-called investment banking and the way it was recreating American business. And so, interestingly to me, I see the parallels in higher ed right now, that our major change agents, banks and lending, technology-oriented entities, strangely enough, the people that you would think would be leading the vectors of change are not necessarily the ones that are at the forefront. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that as a lobbying industry, higher education is uniquely disadvantaged. We're not like Halliburton. We can't lobby, excuse me, for the military scenarios that we want that are good for our business. Many of us are 501c3 charitable companies, corporations, with lobbying restrictions that are very severe, or we work for a state institution, and you know the restrictions on political activity if you work at a state institution. So intriguingly, the change agents in higher education have not necessarily been the industry itself. A lot of the energy for change is coming from outside of higher ed, not inside higher ed. Remember this morning we talked about the surprise attacks of the Dear Colleague letters and that feeling? There may be a reason for this, because we're not the ones leading this change. We did not go to DOE and say, we want gainful employment regulations for the for-profit industry. We did not, as an industry, demand Title IX reform. It was pushed from other forces that were external in some ways to higher education. I think understanding that backdrop is really critical. The role of accrediting bodies has become very interesting. And one thing that's very noticeable now that the federal government is involved in direct lending is accrediting bodies are searching for a mission. Who are we now? Because it used to be very clear what accrediting bodies did in the old world. There was a lot of federal money. And the federal money helped to support the state money. So they often followed each other in tow. And if you wanted to access student loans, if your students did, or student grants, you had to achieve accreditation or the equivalency. So in other words, to get the money, the big pot of money from the federal government, and frankly from your state, the way to the gold was through the accrediting bodies. And that process for years was run largely by our industry. The people on accrediting committees were typically us, our most illustrious members of our community, and we would visit on-site teams, and the usual process would occur. And I think many of you have been through a self-study. Every few years you go through a periodic evaluation, and you go through a self-study process, which is really not a self-study. It's a posturing exercise. And I can be very blunt on this because even though I'm on tape, I'll be glad to. But for most of it, it's a posturing exercise. In fact, the stuff we really didn't want to study was the stuff we didn't want them to look at. So we tended to want to study the things that we wanted them to see. And then the accrediting team would come in and review our elaborate reports. And of course, they have to find something. Otherwise, they didn't do their job. So they would find things. And as the result of our painstaking, painful, multi-meeting, year-long process of self-studying, we would be then given feedback on our self-study. We'd have to come into compliance with these things. Now, if we got a good committee, like one I had one year at our school, the committee members came in and basically said, what do you want? I said, we want a library. Okay, we'll tell you need a library. So then we studied it and we said, we feel we need a library. And the accrediting committee said, we also agree they need a library. And then we got a library. And it was a magic process of being able to leverage our governing bodies to get what we wanted. It was kind of fun. It was probably wrong, but it felt good at the time. But it was anything but a self-study. You know, there've been some real issues on our campus, and we danced around those kind of the way Russians ski carefully near Finland. It's just a little, that's a very abstract reference. Yeah, only like 3 people. I thought maybe being this far north someone would get that, but Okay, that one just bombed. In any event, we would be very careful about the things that were really problematic. And there'd often be a sentence or two, and we'd promise to do better down the road. Then here's what would happen. How many people actually got their accreditation yanked? Almost no one. The process was virtually guaranteed to result in a positive result if you just went through the process the way it had always been gone through. And if you did run into a bump on the road, you would simply go out and hire a really expensive accreditation consultant, and that person would magically help you. Does this sound familiar to anybody? I mean, am I the only one that's been through this? This is how it worked for years and years. Bags of gold at Gringotts. That's a Harry Potter reference. Being disseminated by this federal government, overflowing with money, then to states, and you remember when states actually had money? Like other than North Dakota and Wyoming? I mean, I remember those days. When there was actually money in the government as opposed to great poverty. The system worked this way for a very, very long time. And then all of a sudden, whammo, the federal government comes in, possibly in some relationship to this USA scandal that we mentioned, and says, we're coming in as the direct lender now. We're going to cut the middlemen out. We'll direct lend, technically on the same metrics as before, so the accreditors still have a role, but the problem is now the federal government actually acts like its own accreditor in some ways. They, for example, recently have stepped in and said, oh, there's an interesting idea. We will, I think we'll loan some money directly to a program that doesn't have credit hours, that just assesses competency. Oh my gosh. No one would have dared to do that sort of thing. But can you imagine having the guts to go to your regional accrediting body and say, oh, we abolished credit hours. We're simply going to assess competencies. I mean, you might as well be writing your ticket to a completely different industry. It was accreditation suicide to attempt something like that. And now the federal government says, no, I think we like that idea. We like competency. Show us the badges. Show us what people are learning, and I don't care how much classroom seat time they've got. They're playing the role of accreditor. So meanwhile, the accreditors are trying to figure out, who are we? In this new Game of Thrones, no one watches TV here. Am I the only one who watches? Yeah, I'm getting no reaction here at all. It's like, when is the next speaker on? We'd like to see him shortly, please. What's my role? What am I doing? Because I could be put out of business. They don't really need us anymore. I'm like the little arms on a T-Rex. What did they do? I mean, is evolution passing us by with no purpose? So I noticed something. I don't know if you noticed it lately, but the accrediting bodies have been doing two demonstrable things that I noticed. One is they're willing to pull accreditation from people. And so we've seen a few more incidents of that where we're getting tough. See, you need a bad cop. We'll be that person. We know you don't want to yank anybody's accreditation or pull all their funding, so we'll do it. We'll take them out and yank their accreditation. And the other thing they're doing is we want to look more like you. So the accrediting bodies have started to latch on to things that are not mandated, but are prognosticated. And again, I don't know who's been close to accreditation lately in self-studies, but if you notice the regional accrediting body standards, they have a funny look about them. They kind of look like somebody passed a whole bunch of gainful employment regulations without actually doing that. So we'd like you to articulate your competencies, and we'd like you to articulate outcomes. We want more data on assessment. Can you give us debt to a ratio of graduation time, statistics on employment? You're like, wait a minute, that sounds a lot like what they just did to the for-profit industry, but we don't have gainful employment yet. All we have is a scorecard on the White House page with some threats/promises of future action. But the accrediting bodies, I think, in an effort to remain relevant, are trying to be more White Housey than the White House. Like, what do they want? We'll give it to you. We'll even do it better than you did to remain relevant. And so what I'm noticing is an enhanced accreditation world, even though the accreditors may be losing some status in what's coming. This is one of the big debate points in the future of the Obama agenda. What's the role of accreditors? Are they the bad cop? Are they going to be the hitmen? Are they going to be ghosts, sort of ghost op? And when the department has the temerity to think something but not actually publish it, they'll just do it. So it'll be secret operations and in regulation. I mean, what's it going to come to? And I don't think anybody really knows. I know this is, again, something at my conference in February. We're going to be talking about this, and we'll hopefully have a very open and honest conversation about, should there be an important role for accreditors? If it is, what does it look like? And is it disturbing that the federal government is playing such a hands-on role in accreditation, taking a lot of historical power away from the industry and irrigating it to a federal regulatory body? Who knows? I'd be remiss if I didn't mention supplemental lending, which connects, I think, with accreditation, banks and lending. Everybody knows this. No one wants to say it out loud, but I'm crazy enough to say it out loud. Is the future of higher education isn't quite necessarily the way it's being sold. You know, there's an awful lot of emphasis of we have to reduce costs. We've got to get cheaper education out there, which I think to some extent is true. But the reality is the consumers of higher education spend like they're on shore leave. I mean, when you actually study consumer behavior, it isn't consistent with what the government says the consumers want. And if you want proof, drive to Boston for the weekend. Stand on Massachusetts Avenue in front of MIT and watch what happens. The buses roll up, tourist buses, one after another with families from all over the globe. And they walk their kids out and they point at MIT and they say, this is what you want to do. This is the ultimate goal. To go to MIT requires that a family of 3 generations mortgage their entire future in some cases. And people will gladly do it to put one family member into an institution of that kind. The consumers want to shop at Neiman Marcus. Now, we're being told they really want MOOCs and bargain basement. They want the old Filene's basement. But the reality is, if they can get down to Neiman or Saks, that's where they're going to shop. They're aspirational shoppers, and we know this because educational debt now outstrips everything else. It finally topped over the great demon of credit card debt. And where are people spending their money? They're not buying shoes, they're not buying beach houses, they're buying education. Human capitalization is the next big banking and financial opportunity. Banks know this, and the future clearly lies in a very powerful supplemental lending market. The international bankers are aware of this. They realize if we can normalize Europe, I can lend a kid in Ireland $10,000 to go to school in Italy. And if I normalize the US, I can loan $10,000 to an Irish kid who takes some credits in Ireland, some in Italy, and finishes in the United States. And then if it really works, I can open up markets like Africa, China, Dubai, India, and create a global education capitalization market of unprecedented banking opportunity. I mean, this is clearly on people's minds. I joke around about this. If I were in the retirement session, I would tell people, go find supplemental lenders of higher education product, invest in that, and you'll retire in style. Because that's where the money is. That's where people want to spend their dough. Is they don't value what they used to. They don't want beach houses. They don't want third cars. They want education, and they're willing to spend like crazy for it. So I think the future of accreditation and even the president's agenda may be very connected to a very positive human capitalization movement, which could bring education to billions of people on the planet in a cost-effective way, but it also could be a tremendous profit opportunity for lenders if a system is set up of commensurability and measurement. Is it no mistake that the president's scorecard looks a lot like a credit score? I don't know if you recognize that or not, but basically the stuff you're getting scored on as a college is some of the basic metrics they used in your credit score. And it may evolve even further in that direction. So again, I'm not sure where this is headed, but I want you to understand the platform. Clearly, the financial future of the planet is very dominated by this idea that human capital is the next big market. It's not real estate, it's not weapons, it's not pharmaceuticals, it's not commodities, it's not oil, it's human capitalization. That's a huge lending market. And I know the bankers are thinking that way. What kind of influence they'll have, we'll just have to say. The backdrop. Certainly, economy and student loan did this. The fact that the economy crashed, I think, gave a perfect platform for this because it forced a change in the old systems. The state governments basically ran out of money, the federal government ran out of money, and even more importantly, families ran out of money because a lot of their stored capital was in mortgages in their homes. And when the value of homes plummeted and the liquidity of homes froze up, people lost their access to college money. The great wealth of the Depression era people like my parents was no longer accessible anymore. Liquidity was not there. And let's be honest, in the 90s, did you really care if your kid's college cost went up $5,000 because your home went up $50,000? Just tap into your home equity line, pay for it, move on. But now, where you can't get a second mortgage, can't sell your house, you're upside down, you've been forced out of your home, the capital just isn't there to put people in school and to support that. And then, of course, the state and federal governments ran out of money as well. The war on terror was very expensive for the federal government, very successful in some ways, but war is expensive of any kind, and many of you remember the Vietnam War and the cost that imposed on our country, and in many ways we're back in that same place. State governments have huge infrastructure issues they're going to have to pay for. They need to fix the sewers and the roads and the bridges, and the money for education just is not going to be there. So again, this provided a backdrop. Meanwhile, the cost of education began to climb, and the debt ratio shifted. The students began to take on more and more of a percentage of the cost of their own education. Up until relatively recently, young people's education was heavily subsidized by the generation ahead of them, by the federal government, or other entities. But we've been shifting the cost of education swiftly to learners as opposed to other entities. And it became more visible, particularly legally visible, because college debt is debtor's prison. Unlike other kinds of debt, it's very, very difficult to discharge and manage college debt. Once you've got it, you're stuck with it. And so we started to create a kind of educational debtor's prison with a whole generation of students who were starting to become indentured servants to an abstract debt. Unlike the indentured servants of the 1800s, who learned a trade, in many cases had a skill or would then take over a parcel of land, students today of indenture aren't even sure what they've learned in college or whether it's transferable. They just simply have an abstract debt. So it's, in many ways, the worst kind of indenture with the least ability for debt emancipation. It was a perfect storm birthed out of the Great Recession, and I think it created a great platform. What else was rising? MOOCs, massive online open courses. Okay, I know I'm editorializing a little bit today, but I can't help with this one. It's the 80s. It's video killed the radio star. I hear it playing in the background. MOOCs crack me up because it's a wonderful way if you're Thurn of Udacity. You become a household name and you're teaching statistics. The only other person that pulled that off is Sheldon Cooper. That's a Big Bang joke, people. Okay, you like Big Bang Theory? Yeah, it's a good higher ed show. Okay. Or we've got Michael Sandel at Harvard. And I had Sandel, and it was always kind of apparent to me that he wanted a platform. But when you teach political philosophy, the last time somebody was big in that was Socrates. It just doesn't get you on TV like a televangelist or a race car driver, or it's just not that cool. MOOCs, video killed the radio star. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of people take my course. And then I get to have the ultimate star quality over them, is I get to demonstrate to almost each and every one of them that I'm vastly superior intellect to them. Because the completion rates on a MOOC, are just absurd. I mean, 5-10% is a good day. So it's an interesting product to sell someone. Here's a product, and you're going to fail at it. So but we expect you to come back and buy more of it. From an educational metric, it's almost hilarious. But from a branding perspective, it's brilliant. MTV never really made a huge go of it compared to many other companies. But the people that they launched became gazillionaires. I mean, Michael Jackson bought half of the Beatles and half of Elvis. I mean, he became more financially successful, and a lot of it was due to MTV's success. Look at Madonna. I think she owns Manhattan, right? Didn't she buy that? I'm kidding, of course. You don't care about Manhattan? People in Vermont try to pretend New York City doesn't exist sometimes. It's like, just go away. All right. MOOCs, but this idea that education could be delivered to the masses on an almost cost-free basis, that the brilliant minds of a generation could be disseminated, colleges become unnecessary. Even though we know that learning is an intensely human enterprise and requires a complex interaction of forces for people actually to platform to learning, but the MOOC gives the illusion of connectivity, that you can stand in front of your TV and I think I know Miley Cyrus as a person because I see her on my television in my living room and I relate to her. It gives an illusion of education, but again, a very powerful force to say, see how cheaply we could develop education. And then came Arum's book, which I thought was not in any way irrelevant. The Arum book basically said students are going to college and they're actually being made dumber for it. So that when we measure their outcomes, many of them don't learn anything and some of them actually seem dumber than when they went to college, and so this is actually causing a learning retrograde, and people were reading that book. Again, it's very controversial. I don't agree with all of it, but it did get a lot of attention. Here's the president's graph on costs increasing. That looks bad. Costs outstripping family incomes pretty badly. I'm not a graph or statistics person. I guess I need to take Thurn scores. But I want to show you, this is the kind of graphic representation of the financial catastrophe that we're seeing from the White House. What else is going on? There's been a real discussion inside the Obama administration about which is more important, race or class. Fisher in Texas. What's the future of race-conscious admissions? Just today in the Chronicle, there were front-page stories on people gearing up for the future without race-conscious admissions. I'm putting on a webinar with John Alger from James Madison. John litigated Michigan cases, Carter Gratz, and he's going to talk about the new DOE regulations. The Department of Ed and Justice said, oh, this Fisher case is no big deal. Is it? I think it is. And there's quite a debate about what are we going to be focusing on. But the concern is, and you can see this in the studies and the literature that's out there, is that America is disturbingly returning to the Brown versus Board era. That very, very visibly there's race divisions in access to higher education, the cost, completion, the types of institutions you get into, and there's also a demonstrable class division that's playing out as well, so that it really does matter if you're born to wealth what your educational opportunities look like. It's the 1950s all over again in just a newly recreated way, and a lot of people, including Lumina, Gates, Carnival, and Stroll, good work that they've done, have argued about this. I would strongly urge you, if you want to get into the debate and to see where the law and policy debate, the cutting edge is, I'd pick up books by Richard Collenberg, who's been pushing this idea that the Supreme Court really should focus more on class than anything else, and Randall Kennedy's new book, the Defense of Affirmative Action book that just came out. And I think that those two writers are actually in many ways defining what the agenda inside the Obama administration, the debate looks like inside that administration right as we speak. What are we heading to? And you notice the Sally Mae study is pretty disturbing, isn't it? That really wealthy people are getting more assistance, that if we have any kind of state welfare for education, it's actually going to the rich. And again, that's a disturbing tendency. Yes, sir. Please, please.
Of course, part of the discussion has to be the historic effects of merit-based aid.
Absolutely.
Merit is measuring the academic accomplishments of people typically who have money.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, there are so many threads to this, and for the those of you that aren't joining us today physically, the question that arose is about merit and merit evaluation and its role. And I think this opens up the larger debate is how do we identify educational quality, qualified students, available students, and you get into just a tremendous amount of literature and debate that discusses a lot of those issues. Because one of the things we realize is that your place on the scaffold may well be determined by factors beyond your control at birth. And that includes race and class, maybe both in some cases. and it may include other factors as well. By the way, just a little footnote, and again, just a minor bit of editorializing, but I think it's relevant. When you sit in the presence, it's so rare for us to conjoin forces like this, where Stetson and Vermont are in the same place at the same time. So I take this opportunity to make an appeal to an interdisciplinary audience, but it's been intriguing to me that the one group that gets talked about almost not at all are indigenous people in the United States. The Native American populations are rarely significantly included in this dialogue, and I know that my program at Stetson I don't think we've ever done a significant program that deals with indigenous higher education issues, and I think this is a call to action. That I think if we really want to meaningfully enter a debate about access and opportunity, we can't let this turn into a debate that's been hand-fed to us by certain political issues, that we should include this for everyone that's out there. And I do think it's time that all of our events start to seriously consider programming of that type. So I just throw that out there, a little editorializing, but we will be trying to take that issue up. It's very challenging because we haven't connected with that world, and I think it's time that we do. All right, flipping gears. From the White House. The White House has been active even though we haven't seen it. Since 2009, there's been following of a lot of data, and a lot of statements have been coming out from the White House suggesting the need for innovation, change, data collection, et cetera. For most of us, though, I think the State of the Union address in February 2013 was a defining moment. So for Title IX, we think April 4, 2011, for nonprofit higher education, many of us will carbon date our lives to February of 2013. Because that seems to be an irreversible point. Nonetheless, if you see what I'm saying is the tectonic plates were moving even before there was a noticeable earthquake or shift, that this has been coming a long time. In fact, I was at meetings with DOE officials for several years before February of 2013, and they made a point of telling us that the for-profit gainful employment regulations were just the forerunner of a much larger initiative with respect to nonprofit higher education. So they've been making no bones about the fact that this is an area they intend to move into. Now it's been made much more public by the President's initiative and agendas and statements on the topics. The scorecard was released the day after the address, which I think was one of the monumental moments in trying to measure American higher education. And I think it probably did something that they understood was likely to happen. Is I don't know too many people that stood up and said, you got it just right. That's exactly the scorecard that I want. I mean, wow, that is what I was looking for. Instead, it generated an avalanche of, you should do it this way, you should do it that way, this isn't a good idea, et cetera, et cetera. And the Chronicle and Inside Higher Ed, the New York Times, every literature outlet I can think of has more or less attacked the scorecard in some way. And it has become the battle of metrics. Whose metric is better than someone else's metric? And I'm particularly fond of people who are out there now saying, we will ignore the White House scorecard, we will create our own metric. And on this metric, we look great. So you want a metric? I got a metric. Everybody's got a metric. It's an era of metrices. And what was that old diet drink, Metrical? That went through my head. The battle of metrics is on, people, but the White House has the upper hand, right? Let's be honest, because they control the money. So we'll be curious to see how the White House metric evolves. They have talked about that evolution, and with time permitting, I'll do a little bit more work with you on that. Knowing that the scorecard was controversial, along with the supplemental memo that came out after the speech, the President hit the road to stump and made 3 very significant stops that will be long remembered in higher education to go out and promote the idea of accountability. And we saw the Knox College speech and then the 2-day bus tour that was done. He made other statements as well, but the visit to UCM, Knox, et cetera, these were defining moments in the President's agenda. Reading those speeches is really interesting. He's very on message. He's on message with all of the comments that he takes from the audience. And it's more or less the same thing all the time. Shake up higher education, quality, affordability, et cetera, a full-blown agenda. In fact, as we'll see, there's actually a metric that underlies the metric for the way the White House agenda has been structured. So it looks a little haphazard. You're turning on the evening news and you think, why is the president at the University of Central Missouri? You know, why there? And I'm, by the way, a huge fan of UCM. We're good friends, and President Ambrose is a buddy of mine, and I really admire the work they're doing there. I know why the president visited there, but you just might wonder, Warrensburg? You know, Kansas City's right up the street. You know, why wouldn't you go there? Why of all places would you pick this? And when you step back from it, there's a reason. One of the reasons he picked UCM is because of its pipeline program. UCM has an innovation campus where you can go from high school and start qualifying for college credit as you're going to the high school. And UCM has been a league leader in trying to come up with innovative solutions. President's aware of that. And in many ways, they discovered some of this information when UCM was audited by the federal government under other metrics a few years before that. So they'd been taking intelligence on the field and then discovered places that they wanted to go and put their idea. On the 2-day bus tour, we got the first indication of the 3-step approach, which I'll talk about here in just a second with a slide that'll be coming up, but we get rolled out that the White House will be using this 3-step approach to evaluating schools, and in many ways the blueprint of the future is all there. It gives you a really clear idea of where this administration wants to head. I don't know, gosh, I hate speculating on this, and I don't mean to sound political because you actually probably never guess my politics even if you tried, but it looks like the president might have an opportunity to gain even more members of Congress for the next, I mean, this whole government shutdown thing, I'm watching the numbers on Republican acceptability levels, and I'm thinking, he's thinking I'm going to be able to clean up with my agenda in the last 2 years by getting an even stronger presence in Congress. I'm not sure that's true, but I get that feeling that this is leading up to that, meaning what? This 3-part scorecard we're going to talk about is not fait accompli, but the stars are definitely lining up right now in a way that makes it sure seems like it's going to come. Let me take a minute with the scorecard, and then we'll go and find our way to the 3-step approach. How did this scorecard come about? Well, first of all, you've got the Department of Education has its own College Affordability and Transparency Center. So it's been working on this for some time. This isn't just a single-handed White House creation. There's clearly been some collaboration. And the current scorecard focuses on just a couple of features to the exclusion of many others: cost, graduation rate, loan default rate, and median amount borrowed. This is a protozoan credit score. It essentially is, if there's now a 4th major credit agency out there and it rates your colleges, you could see where people would immediately jump up and down about this kind of a metric. Because we're talking about cost, we're not talking about value. So some places cost a lot, but you get a lot. Some places don't cost very much, and you don't get very much. And so cost can be a little misleading in terms of value, which might be more significant. Graduation rate. This is one that's very controversial because I'll say this and I'll stake this position out. A low graduation rate is sometimes a good thing. Sometimes you want that. Some schools actually are designed to be feeder schools for other systems. In other words, people, that's how they've thrived for years, is come for a couple years with us. You may complete here, but if you don't, that's fine. We'll help you find an institution that has the program that you want. There's nothing particularly nefarious about the fact that a student doesn't complete at their own institution. But under the president's scorecard, you can lose points in some cases if your people are doing what they want to do, what they should be doing, and coming and trolling for a couple years at your school and going someplace else. I mean, Chuck's in the room at RPI, one of the great technology schools in the world, and you know, you're going to have a kid walk in your office and say, I think I want to go to Cal Poly. I mean, I really think they've got a program and an instructor that I need. Now, are you going to want to be sitting there thinking, trying to talk that kid to stay at your school just because they're a tuition unit under the president's scorecard? I want to write that transfer letter. I want to say, you're right, that teacher actually is the Nobel Prize winner in your field, and I could see why you'd want to go, and you've got the marks to do it. You want to help students like that. But the scorecard gets us to lock in on our customers and try to keep them with us, even if it's not necessarily in their best interest. Loan default rates are squirrely because in many cases, students default on loans for reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with their education experience. And it may be due to other factors completely different. And for example, loan default rates at some community colleges run higher than they do in other sectors. But part of the reason you're seeing that is that the students that are coming have already had economic challenges in their life, and they're trying to rehabilitate that. So you're really trying to create a population that can get out of economic penury. But then what's the incentive? Is you start screening for credit score at your community college level to only take people that will pay off their loans, and you move away from your mission. So these are some of the challenges that are raised. Median amount borrowed, again, I think this really skews particularly by class. Families that are trying to move up in economic class are likely to borrow a lot more for an economic opportunity. So is that a bad thing? It may be that your school gets penalized because you've historically drawn students from lower economic indicators who are trying to better themselves, but they're going to do really, really well. My Stetson law students were a classic third-tier law school, and we have a lot of kids that are shooting for the big leagues. This is their chance to swing at a big pitch and take a shot for themselves and their family to a different economic level. They borrow a lot of money, so our median economic level is high, but we also have people who typically don't default on loans and do get good jobs over the long period. So I'm a little suspicious of a metric like this because that's who we are at Stetson. We give a lot of people a chance to become lawyers whose family didn't create the platform that easily occur in other circumstances. And I'm proud of that, not ashamed of it. But again, the scorecard goes that way. There's more to say about it, but again, I will hit you with a couple major complaints that have come out there. In the future, the scorecard's going to evolve. The White House has made this clear. They talk about types of jobs being part of the scorecard so that students will have a sense of, I go to this school, it tracks towards this kind of career, these kinds of jobs. There's talk about income, not just default levels. This has been very controversial with the for-profit industry. They've been fighting this cats and dogs, but the Department of Ed, at least under Arne Duncan's leadership, seems obsessed with income-based assessment of outcomes. I have my thoughts about that. All I can say there is that, do you really want to encourage people to take the highest paying job they can get on graduation or the best job they can get for a long career? I mean, these are people who are going to live to be 100 years old, and they're going to have many jobs. Do you really want them to short sheet their career just to get a high income statistic going out the door? Query. That's an issue that's come up. There may be many other metrics as well. Again, time doesn't permit us to dig into all of them, but I think this is not it. Classic statement from the president. There's a feeling at the government level that we're subsidizing schools, many of whom are not producing. This has a no child left behind feeling to it. So the cynical statement among a number of people is this every child's left behind? Are we going to focus so much on money and so much on outcome assessment that we're going to create a higher ed system that teaches to tests, teaches to outcomes, teaches to get a high-paying job, but doesn't actually serve the needs of the country in the long run? Again, this is the debate that's in the air, and I think this administration and subsequent ones will have to confront that. The three-step approach. You will notice that the three classic metrics that are here are laid out, and Obama clearly is following this agenda. This is what he talked about when he hit the road show, and where the emphasis points were, is paying colleges and students for performance. Performance-based measurement. I see two things happening simultaneously, and it's important to see students and colleges. Your school will only qualify for so much financial aid and so much direct federal lending based on the assessment metrics. You're going to get a packet. If you go over that, you're going to have to go to the supplementary lending facilities to get that money. You're going to get an allocation, and it's going to be based on a variety of metrics. As I suggested to you this morning, I have every reason to believe that FSA will connect this with the other compliance objectives, so that how you score on Title IX, safe and drug-free school, affordability, debt-to-income ratios. All of this stuff is going to factor into the amount of money that you can qualify for and that your students can qualify for. But I also think what's coming is individual students are going to get rated. This is your 5th year of college, Van Wilder. The money's done. We're not giving you 6, 7 years. We're going to loan you for 4 years in this program, not for 5. If you want 5, here's a list of approved supplementary lenders. You can borrow all you want from them, but the federal government won't give it to you. I'm sorry, you want to go pre-med, and you're getting C's in your math class. The spigot just turned off. No money for you. I think that applying for student loans, particularly in the supplementary market, is going to be a lot like going through a mortgage application. And you're going to be put through the ringer in terms of your finances, decisions you've made, and outcomes. High-performing students will draw more money. Students on a path that's leading nowhere may get no money at all. And this could happen to people in their junior and senior years, which means that enrollment management is going to be a critical feature of what we do, helping students make choices that will set them up to qualify for the money they need to persist. It won't take you a minute to figure out that if we aren't good at this, it'll set up Renvoi, because we won't keep a student, and then our graduation rates won't look good, so we won't qualify for as much money, and then students of high quality won't come to our institution, so they will have more trouble when they come, and so on and so on. Do you see the snowball running down the hill? This is a blueprint for putting some schools out of business. You could fall into a death spiral with this. If you're not careful, should be careful to see it coming. Promoting innovation that cuts costs and improves quality. Here's an innovation. How about telling the Department of Ed and Justice not to fine everybody for violations of federal law, but instead give that money back to the programs to help them? That would be innovative. I said it out loud, but the government's not working today, so they can't hear me. Yay. Yay. By the way, a lot of these lessons would be well heard in Congress. There's editorializing. Okay. Innovation, looking for programs that are innovative. How do we get people through programs more quickly? I think 3-3 programs are going to be incredibly popular. 3 years college, 3 years graduate school, or 2 years. Some combo programs with grad school are going to be very, very popular. I think the same thing with high schools. So 3-3 arrangements with high schools are going to become more popular. Pipeline programs. And one of the emphasis points in Bologna is, can you be picking up multiple credits or learning opportunities from a singular experience so that you could put a student in a class in high school that has college quality credit associated with it, and they're gaining a credit in high school and in college at the same time. This is the kind of innovation that's being looked out there. I imagine innovation in teaching is also going to be emphasized, but I don't know that they're going to do the same thing they've done with K through 12. Helping students manage loan debt. This is a real interesting one to me. The Obama agenda, I think, turns a lot on winning young voters who have high debt back to the Democratic Party. It seems to be a very important part of their political agenda, is to getting them on their side. But it's going to be very hard for the federal government to give up the money it's owed. And it may require a backdoor subsidization of people who've already been through higher ed to keep that kind of a process going. Actually, what's really happening with students right now is pretty dark. The incentive, as we'll see, is for students to seek out employment in the not-for-profit sector, whether they want to do it or not. So you get debt emancipation if you work for certain types of nonprofit entities. One of the more favorite techniques that's going on right now is people are coming back to work at their own schools. We're creating a new class of underemployees, which I think the government itself is getting worried about too. But people are returning to their schools because they're 501c3s, and they're taking jobs that were once held by people with salaries, and they're being put in those jobs at cut hours and cut rates and cut benefits, and essentially forced into the job, because if they take a job in the private sector, in order to cover their debt payment, they'd have to make 5 times what they make at a 501c3. This is a real problem that's burdening, is deliberate underemployment in the public sector. People who are working for the public good, not really. They're working there only because they need debt emancipation. It's really kind of sad, but a lot of my law students are looking for work at my school once they graduate, and they say, can you get me a job? It doesn't even have to be more than $30,000, because I'll show you what my loan situation looks like, and if I come work for you for 30 grand, I can actually eat and have a car, but I'd have to get a $90,000 a year job in the private sector to live at the same standard of living. It's kind of perverse, and unfortunately that's one of the things that the administration in its three-step approach is going to have to confront. All right, we hit the denouement. Reformation or retrograde. Are we going forward or backwards? I don't know. You decide. Who's winning? Who's losing? The banks may be able to create a global human capital facility of unprecedented proportions, which could be good. It might be the way for millions, even billions of people to gain higher education and to do so on a global basis. Employers, this is an interesting one. On the one hand, it seems like they're being able to transfer the cost of job training to the people who are at least able to pay for it. So the employers are having a field day. It's like, you get job trained for I don't train you, you come fully trained and you pay for your own training. So we may be shifting that training to workers as opposed to business entities. But on the other hand, with the new black swan rules and the new fair labor standards out there, there's been a lot of concern about internships, and a lot of low-cost work that was being done may now be unlawful, and so the employers may be losing on one end and gaining on another. I don't know. You decide. What about students? Well, you know, they may get cost-effective, faster training. They may get better debt relief. I mean, on paper, this looks like a big student win, but one of the concerns that I have, and I think others have voiced as well, is are we encouraging students to cheat themselves out of high-quality education and getting them overly focused on first job opportunities as opposed to lifelong learning and education? Are we killing liberal arts and the value of a lifelong learning experience to get a desirable short-term outcome? Again, you decide, but it's certainly in the air. What about families? This, I think, is a very interesting question because families often underwrite the cost of higher education and substantially support it. Will families become the next indebted generation? Will they pick up the supplementary loans that their kids won't qualify for? Because I see a world where student doesn't qualify, but family does. So this family takes out some kind of secured loan because their kids can't. And so I do worry about a secondary in debtors market, people who didn't even go to school taking on debt that they now have to pay back. Frankly, I'm already seeing that. I see a lot of parents pirating their retirement stuff so the kids can go to school. And what we're doing is we're paying from one source to another. It's a disturbing trend, not often focused on. What about institutions of higher education? It could be really good because I think we probably do need a shake-up. It's been a long time since higher education really went through a true reformation, and I see some really cool things on the table. Why get stuck in a credit hour? Why get stuck in a semester? Why do we have these programs but not others? I mean, for example, why isn't there a master's in higher education in law and policy? Why does no American institution offer an MED with a focus in law and policy? It's not forward-thinking. I mean, obviously that's a degree that's desirable in Compliance U, but we aren't innovation leaders. We're still in the 1800s and 1700s. We take our time. Maybe this will shake the tree and move us forward, but are we losing academic freedom along the way? Are we being taken over by external matrices that we didn't even really create? Created more likely by interest groups than by internal groups to the higher education system? I don't know. What about society? Does society benefit from this? I mean, Lumina, the president, all seem to agree that higher completion rates are an all-purpose good. Is that true? I'll let you decide. Again, I don't know, but I do worry about getting high completion rates for something that's only successful in the short run. But what about the long term? Are we going to have people 15 or 20 years from now who are undereducated, underemployed, because they were overemployed and overeducated for a specific task at graduation? I'd love to hear people like Chuck Carletta chime in on this because the science angle to me is very significant. Is this the end of innovation over a lifetime? Is Bell Laboratories really, truly something in the rearview mirror? where that idea of longitudinal planning and development is gone. I don't know. What about the economy? On the one hand, I think pumping more college graduates into the economy might backfire. We might actually end up with too many people with college degrees. We already have a lot of that. Maybe we're channeling people in the wrong direction, encouraging them to college too soon for false purposes. I don't know. Or will it be a huge benefit? Maybe the real benefit of this is that we could end up with a door out of the recession by creating an explosion in capital markets that could really benefit the country. The United States, I think, is well positioned to become the global higher education bank. And if that is true, then we've essentially become the biggest Cayman Island and the largest Switzerland in history. We could become the most powerful banking system again in the world. And maybe this is the blueprint for that, which could potentially be very good. I leave that up to you. Who knows? I wish I could look at the President's Book of Secrets. Hurting liberal arts, there's an awful lot of pushback on liberal arts and the pain that this is causing liberal arts. I'm doing a session on this at my conference in February. We're going to talk with college presidents about what's the future of liberal arts look like in this world? How do we survive and thrive? I think it's a real challenge. Could it be that an entire sector of education is about to get hit by the meteor and there just won't be big dinosaurs anymore? There'll be lots of little furry creatures running around. Is that what's going to happen? Or do we have to come to grips with it? Or is there a better future for liberal arts? I think the President's agenda puts that on. I did mention the unpaid internships issue, taking jobs for loan forgiveness. The one thing I didn't mention was the return of peonage, which most people think I'm crazy when I talk about this, but it actually concerns me gravely. And I think it's an issue we need to be talking and grappling with very directly, because one of the techniques I see that's on the table for students to get loan forgiveness is to promise future income to their state governments. I don't know if you've seen these proposals, but they're flying around a lot of states. In fact, I think Washington State or Oregon has been exploring this in more detail, so that we will give you a subsidized college education, and in return, you'll give us 10% of your future income. And by the way, the last time a system like that was in place was right after the Civil War. It's often comes under the name of peonage and may well violate the 13th Amendment and specific acts of Congress that were designed to stop buying people's human capital. Because when you start to own a piece of their future that way, you start taking a piece of them and it actually becomes an equivalent to slavery in a sense. And the fact that people are talking about this now and not recognizing the implication of owing the state 10% of whatever you make the rest of your life to get a college education really scares me, because this kind of thing has happened in other societies before, and I thought we settled this after watching the movie about Lincoln and the 13th Amendment. I thought this was off the table, and here it comes back again. The things people are tempted to do when they're running out of money. So I give you this run through of the President's agenda. I hope that the handout is helpful to organize this for you, but I really think when you go back to your campuses, you should have this dialogue on your campus. You should be talking, what does the President want? How is he going to achieve it? And what are the implications for us? What are the forces that are making change today? And I leave you with one thought. It sure feels like the 80s to me. I see video stars, banks, and technology changing things. And the thing I'm really worried about is innovation in a business that really evolves should be coming from inside the businesses themselves. That was the great lesson of the 80s. I hope we learn it again. Thank you for your patience. It's great to see all of you. I hope we'll see you down the road. Enjoy the rest of this fantastic conference.